started talking about Japan last time, and we sort of finished discussing Shinto. And we looked at the principal shrine at Ise. And what I want to start with today is the arrival of Buddhism and how that's going to change things in the same way that it changed a lot of things in China. It's going to change a lot of things in Japan. It's of course going to bring a rich narrative tradition, because the Buddhism that will arrive is Mahayana. So it comes with all of its deities and all of its Buddhas and sort of a complex, fairly well-developed imagery by this time. We know exactly when it formally entered, and that is 552, because that is when the king of the dominant dynasty in Korea sent a gift to the Japanese emperor of a sculpture. It seems that it was a sculpture group, probably a triad. We don't have that piece anymore, but sent it to the emperor, and he also sent copies of a lot of the written sutras written in Chinese. Now, the Japanese had known about Buddhism. There were foreign workers there from Korea and China, but just like in China, at first it was just a religion of foreigners. So it takes a little while before it's completely embraced, but it doesn't take too long before the imperial family embraces it. And once it has that kind of support, of course, it's going to become popular pretty quickly. The people we associate with really the early support of Buddhism were the Empress Suiko and her nephew, Prince Shotoku. These are two of the most famous people in Japanese history. She was actually the first empress to rule Japan, the 33rd official imperial ruler, but the first woman, and she was a great supporter and sponsor of Buddhism throughout her reign. She is very well known. She ushered in what is considered a kind of golden age in Japan, a sort of gave rise to a real sort of literate culture, etc. The Japanese, when they got these sutras, began applying Chinese ideograms to the Japanese language, because at that time there was no written Japanese language. For quite a while, they just used Chinese characters, but it won't be too long before they develop their own sort of phonetic written language. And when we say someone didn't have a written language, that's somewhat deceptive, because written language is not, it doesn't jump from writing nothing to having the complex written language that we have today. Usually there are slow intermediate steps. There are usually figures and symbols for writing numbers, for keeping records, things like that. But it didn't have a complex written language associated with things like poetry or complicated philosophical narratives. That wasn't there yet. Her nephew ruled as what is referred to as a regent, and it's not the same thing as a regent in the West. When we talk about someone being a regent, when we're talking about Europe, for example, that usually refers to someone who is ruling because the formal or official ruler is indisposed. Usually they're too young to rule, so a regent will be appointed until the actual king reaches a certain age. Well, that's not what it means in Japan. A regent is a permanent position, and emperors basically hire a regent or someone to kind of be an administrator for them. So him being her regent doesn't really have the same relationship. He was actually the regent for rulers before her as well. So he was the administrator. He really runs the country. It's almost like in England, you know, the Queen and the Prime Minister. It's sort of like that relationship a little bit more than anything else. But they were, for all intents and purposes, very close. They were family, but they really relied on one another. And you know, she was obviously quite a lot older than him, but they were very, very close and almost ruled as one in a way. There was some opposition at first among the Shinto establishment to Buddhism, which is not unusual. You know, you don't know what this new religion is. You know, there was some opposition in China as well. You know, it was feared that it's mostly political opposition. Are these people trying to take over, or what are they? But they very quickly, I won't say they merged, but they became very coexistent, because they each changed each other to a certain extent, because they both had great reverence for life, and that tended to be what they focused on. Prince Shotoku is very important for sending scholars to China to study Buddhism more, and to learn more about it, and the like. So we're dealing in this early period with this early recognition and development. By 614, there were 46 Buddhist temple complexes in Japan, but it's going to go very quickly. And there were also about 1,300 ordained monks and nuns who were ordained by Chinese. There are still Chinese monks coming over constantly and doing the ordination and the teaching and the like. So that's where we stand. This is one of the earliest works we have. It is from this period. It's considered in the style of the period of Empress Suiko. This sculpture group was actually commissioned by her at the time of Prince Shotoku's death. He died in 622, and he was only 48 at that time. She was in her 70s, and this was a great loss for her. She was very sad, so she commemorated this to his spiritual well-being. She died, I think, 6 years, pardon me, after that. But it's a very important piece. And while we don't have that original group sent from Korea, it is widely believed that this is very similar, that the early influence was of the Korean style, and this really is not really a developed Japanese style yet. So the early influence is Korean, because that's what they saw. It's a very famous piece. Toribushi is identified as the artist, which isn't a person's name. Bushi means maker of Buddha images, and it was actually a school of sculptors for several generations of artists who made works of art under the name sort of Toribushi, which identifies a group rather than an individual. It's known as the Shaka triad. Shaka is simply the Japanese name for Shakyamuni. One of the things I love about Japanese is they will take long names and just cut them off or clip them down, making it much easier to know names. So Shaka is just Shakyamuni. So it's a Shaka triad, which is kept in a building called a kondo, and we're going to look at this building a little bit later, at a temple known as Horyuji. It is bronze, and they are actually not sculpted in the round. They're hollow, and they're almost a kind of relief sculpture. They don't really have a back to them. You can almost kind of see it from the side, but they're not really sculpted all the way around. As you can see here, we have Shakyamuni in his, wait a minute. Okay, we have Shakyamuni in his fear not pose and generosity pose, two bodhisattvas on either side. It's very sort of squared off features, and it's what we do see in it that is Japanese, that we'll see later, is a really strong sense of abstract design. And you see it in these wonderful folds of this drapery. It's very stylized and very elegant and very abstract. Drapery can be really ugly when the way it falls. It can be very natural. In this case, it can be very abstract. It's something we do look at in art. If you remember, we talked about that in looking at, say, Greek art and Roman art and Renaissance art, how drapery falls. It really identifies sort of a point of view. It is fairly heavy drapery. It's not like real clean. You don't see the body. It's not real clingy to the body. And the mandorla behind them has very stylized forms that sort of suggest vegetation. I mentioned before that often there are, because since he was sitting under a Bodhi tree, there's often something referencing a tree, like vines or plants. In this case, those are also very stylized. The Toribushi style we see here in the eyes, they tend to have these very narrow almond-shaped eyes that tend to sometimes slant upwards. They tend to have a very long and wide nose, which you see here. The upper lip tends to be pointed, little points on the lip. It's hard to see, but all of these sort of identify a Korean style as well as the Toribushi style. So a very, very early example of a triad. One of my favorite pieces is this miniature of a building. It's basically a model. It's called a miniature condo, and it's not a condo like our condo. A condo is a building we will find in a monastery complex. The Nelson Gallery actually has two of these. It's very similar to one in the Nelson. They stand about life size or about the size of a person, and they're a model of a building. This one's kind of important because it shows us an architectural style at a time when we have no actual architecture from this period. We don't have any Asuka architecture, but we have a model of a building. So we can see this early hip gabled roof. This is known as the Tamamushi Shrine, and it is kept in the same building as that sculpture group we just looked at. What I want to really look at is one of these painted panels. It's made out of wood, camphor wood and cypress, and it's called the Tamamushi Shrine because of the Tamamushi beetle, which is a really beautiful beetle that has these iridescent wings. And originally, you can see all this sort of ornate, there's this ornate metalwork along here and all along these layers. It's sort of an open cut metalwork. And originally, behind that metalwork were beetle wings, Tamamushi beetle wings. So the color all the way around this would have this iridescent color on all these levels all the way around. It must have been beautiful. Obviously, those dry out and blow away. They would have to be probably replaced fairly regularly, and they're long gone, but you can kind of imagine how beautiful that would have been. We also see they have a system that's similar to the Chinese system, a bracketing system, but this is the earliest known use of what are called cloud brackets. It's a sort of design or shape of a form of clouds. It's a form you often see both in Chinese and Japanese painting for clouds in the sky. That's why it's called the cloud bracket. But the panel I want to look at is this panel that shows us the story of Prince Mahasattva, and we've actually encountered this story before when we looked at the Mahasattva Jataka, because the story of Prince Mahasattva is from the Mahasattva Jataka. And I remind you where we saw that in China when going all the way back to the Dunhuang caves. And remember, we read the story. The Chinese version tells you the whole story. You read this from right to left, and then from left to right, and then down from right to left. It's the whole story of the three brothers. But the panel here simply tells us really the important scene. Remember, Mahasattva and his brothers encountered the hungry tigress, or the starving tigress, with her cubs, and he sends his brothers away and then offers himself to the tigress to eat, but she won't kill him. But so to save her from negative karma, he goes up on this mountain and throws himself off, and when he's dead, then she eats him. And so it's sort of the ultimate self-sacrifice is sort of the symbolism, but also he was saving her the negative karma from murdering him. So it's a very popular story, very popular Jataka tale, and one told here in a continuous narrative where we see him up above and then jumping off and then down below. But it's also very abstract. Like, what are these things that are swirling around? Are these like scarves blowing in the wind? It's really impossible to say. The whole thing is told in a very abstract manner, very different from the more down-to-earth or straightforward Chinese version of the subject. During this period, the Hakuho period that follows, Hakuho means the white phoenix. It's a reference to the phoenix, which is a powerful symbol. The phoenix is in Japanese art, is a symbol of good government, is generally how it's seen. The phoenix in Chinese art tended to symbolize the empress, but this is a different symbolism. So as at the same time, China is entering the Tang dynasty. And remember, the Tang was not only a golden age in China, but it was a very international period, and their influence was spreading very widely. So in Japan during this period, Chinese influence replaces Korean influence. And so we see a lot of Chinese influence during this period. The Soga clan is removed from power. And I want to say something about the clans in Japan. Princess Suiku was actually a member of the Soga clan, a powerful family. Powerful families in Japan learned very, very early the way to wield power was through the emperor. And in this early period, what they tended to do was marry off a daughter into the imperial family. And then through her and through her children, they would have power because of that imperial connection. Now, that relationship is going to change. It will still be there, but in later periods, these powerful families or clans will have less need of the imperial family, and they won't necessarily keep marrying people into the family, but at this early date they do. So as clans lose and gain power, the imperial family shifts and changes in many ways. So as they move out of power, a new family will take power, and that is the Fujiwara family, and we'll talk about them in a minute. From this point on, much of the goals of ruling power in Japan is going to be toward unifying the country. China was more unified early on because of its imperial system. The Chinese emperor was from the very beginning all powerful. That is not and never was the case in Japan. The Japanese emperors never had the power to unite the country. Their power lay in the military clans who they could align with. So it was beneficial, but because there were so many warring military clans, it took many, many years or centuries for one clan to become dominant. It's mostly a period of warfare and conflict between the clans, and we will talk more about that. The major city during this period becomes Nara, and Nara is really the holy city in Japan. It still is to a great extent. It became the center of Buddhism, the center of support. And if in 624 there were 46 temples, 70 years later, there were over 500 Buddhist temples. It's growing that fast. That's like, and I don't mean buildings, this is temple complexes. So this is a big complex. So that's like 8 a year for 70 years. That's a lot of growth. And I want to look at one. It's one of the most famous, but there are many. We'll look at some other sites, but not in this detail. This is the site of Horyuji in Nara. When you see a -ji at the end, that means temple complex. So it's the Horyu Temple Complex. Actually, the whole name means Temple of the Exalted Law, is what it translates into. And it's a temple compound, really. It's actually been rebuilt. There was an original complex built here from the earlier Asuka period under a Chinese, very Chinese style. There was a fire, some destruction. It was rebuilt on more of a Japanese plan. Originally, this building here is the gateway, the entranceway. And originally you entered here and walked straight back, and the buildings were symmetrically placed, just like we saw, in the imperial city and the like. When it was rebuilt as a lateral plan. In other words, you enter the Chumon, which is the gate, and we're going to look at other Chumons and look at sculpture in them later. But in this plan, you enter and then you turn right or left. You don't walk straight in. If you walk to the right, you come around, and now you see an east entrance. So there's an east-west axis here. It's a very different kind of axis. It doesn't have that strict northern-southern axis, but there's a bit of that because it was an older building. Also, when it was rebuilt, originally this walkway went straight across. They added this area to the back when they rebuilt it because it was bigger and they needed more space. So the Chumon is the gateway. The Kondo, this is the building that held the Shaka Triad and the Tamamushi Shrine that we were looking at. They actually were from an earlier period, and fortunately, they were not in this building at the time it burned, or they would have been lost. They had been placed outside, and I'm not even sure why, but for whatever reason, they're in this building now. So Kondo literally means the Golden Hall, and it's a new kind of building. You didn't see them in Chinese monasteries. It's a building that's filled with sculpture and painting on the walls. And usually the sculpture is sort of in the center up on a kind of platform, and you can circumambulate that platform. So it's called the Golden Hall. It's where treasures like these are kept. And then it's going to have a traditional pagoda, which is just like it was in China. It is a stupa, and we'll look at one of those in more detail. This coda at the back, this is a kind of lecture hall. This is a monastery, monks are studying, and it's basically a study hall. And these are, one of them is a library. I think both of them are actually libraries. But this is typically what you will see in a Japanese monastery complex. This is the Kondo, and it's there are Chinese elements to it, but there are also distinctly Japanese elements to it. The emphasis on the horizontality is very Japanese. The slope of the roof line, which is a very low and gradual slope that emphasizes the horizontal. The fact that it's not brightly and richly painted and adorned as a Chinese building would be, which would have been very brightly painted and colored, is different. This hip gable roof. This is what you saw in the Tamamushi Shrine, but that was from the Asuka period. Now this is the Kohu period. We do have them from this period, and it's elevated on a platform or a plinth. This is also very Japanese. The pagoda is much smaller than pagodas we saw before. This is a wooden pagoda in design. It's all about, in buildings like this, it's really all about the relationship between these two buildings. You know, how they're placed and how they physically relate to one another is an important part of the design, as we see it. Now, the Chinese pagoda we looked at, the one on the right, Fogongzi, we looked at from the northern Sung, was much, 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 much bigger. Remember, each one of these 5 stories is actually four more stories in between it. So this thing is quite massive, where you can clearly see from the people that this isn't anywhere near that scale. You can also still see some of the paint and the elaborate detail. This is much more vertical emphasis, where this is much more horizontal, but the symbolism is still there. You can still see the details of the symbolism. Here's a design, a sort of an elevation of this building. We still have up above, interestingly, you know, the 9 levels. Remember the 9 steps we saw in the Borobudur stupa that we saw, the 9 levels there. It was in the Tibetan stupa here. The central ridgepole now that we see here is known as a heart pillar. It's called the heart pillar, and it goes way down underground, and it sits on a large stone at the base, which has been hollowed out, and in that stone is where the relics would be kept. Usually there are a number of sutras that are considered relics in places like this. I think there's a piece of bone that purports to be from the remains of Shaka Buddha, but I seriously doubt that that's the case. I doubt if any of them made it out of India. But anyway, we all know there's a lot of bone relics everywhere in the world. So their relationship is a very important one. There is an important link between these two buildings in a way as well, because one, the stupa sort of symbolizes the absolute, where the kondo symbolizes the sort of mundane world. The stupa here is also venerated primarily from the outside. Nobody really goes in but monks. And again, we see the whole complex together. So as I said, this is a small one. We're going to be looking at some much, much larger ones. So it's very, very early on. This Nara, well, this is a painting inside. I forgot, this is inside the condo. And it's a scene we're familiar with, once again, which we saw before. There were originally 12 murals all around the walls, but with that fire, most of them were lost or damaged, or one or two remain. Well, the fire I'm talking about is not that original fire. That original fire destroyed the whole building. There was a fire in 1949 that destroyed the newer condo, and this is one of the few that remained. Now, this is painted directly on the wall, but it's not a fresco. It's painted directly on a wooden wall. It has like really hard outlines. It's very Chinese influenced. I remind you of the Amitabha that we saw at Dunhuang. Pure Land Buddhism enters fairly early into Japan and becomes very popular. We're going to be seeing more Pure Land images. The three most popular types of Buddhism in Japan are Pure Land, esoteric Buddhisms, and Zen. Those are the three predominant, and they're still the pretty much the only three that dominated. As in China, the emphasis on Amida's Pure Land is as a place of beauty. Now, in China, it was equated with the imperial palace. So you see in the Chinese painting buildings and grounds that are reminiscent of the Chinese emperor's palace. We don't see that in Japan, but it is still an attempt to depict something that is distinctly beautiful. Now, it's true that at this time, it's very likely that this artist was Chinese. I mean, most of the artists in Japan at this time really are still Chinese, and there are Chinese artists here teaching Japanese artists. So the connection's still very strong. Amida is now flanked by his two bodhisattvas, one of whom was Avalokiteshvara, or Kuan Yin in China. In Japan, he is Kannon. So Kannon is one of the two, and there are many figures of Kannon in Japanese art. The Nara period, now I want to say something about these names as well. In China, the names of periods, dynasties, were generally associated with a change of dynasty, and they were usually names that were invented. You know, like I want to name my reign the Golden Era, so it's called the Ming. So things like that. In Japan, these periods are almost always named after the city from which it is ruled. So Nara, in this case, it's being ruled from Nara. A lot of Tang influence during this period, and the city itself is really being modeled on the Chinese capital of Chang'an. Esoteric Buddhism is growing during this period, especially, well, there are three different types of esoteric Buddhism: Keigan-kyo, Shingon, and Tendai. Keigan-kyo is what the imperial family practiced. There are slightly different emphases. They tend to focus on one of the other five transcendental Buddhas. The Pure Land focused on Amida, where the esoterics, particularly Kegon Kyo, focused on Vairocana, one of the other five, who is known by a different name under each sect. It gets confusing. It's all Vairocana, but he's called Roshana under one of these sects, Biroshana as another, and Rushana in another, but it's all Vairocana. It's all the same guy. It's during this period that we get what a work that is really the most famous. It's usually considered the greatest example of early Japanese art, and it is another triad group. It is Yakushi triad. It's from Yakushi-ji. Yakushi is another, not one of the five transcendents, but it is another archetypal Buddha. Yakushi is sometimes referred to as the healing Buddha or medicine Buddha. And it's under the influence of esoteric Buddhism that you find, excuse me, that you find these various figures. So Yakushi-ji is built specifically to honor Yakushi, or the medicine Buddha. He's recognizable usually because of his hand positions. You see that left hand, we haven't seen that position of the left hand before. He would originally have been holding a bowl in that hand. And when you see a Buddha figure holding a bowl on his lap, that's always going to be medicine Buddha or the healing Buddha. Bowls are associated with medicine like that. You see that also in classical mythology. You could also always recognize a mother goddess or a healing female figure because she was holding usually a jar or a bowl, because that was associated with medicine and healing as well. So here we get Yakushi, and this is in the, okay, between the previous period and this period, they stopped using the word kondo and started using the word hondo, but it means the same thing. So this is in the hondo at Yakushi-ji in Nara. The Chinese influence is pretty clear. The two bodhisattvas on either side are named Nikko and Gakko, sunlight and moonlight, and they are mirror images of one another. Now, one reason this grouping is so valued today is because of this beautiful patina on the bronze surfaces. It's an unusual color. It's very, very dark, almost a black, but not quite. It's unusual. Bronze will mature to many different colors. It totally depends on the exact chemical mixture of the bronze, the proportion of copper and tin, and whether any other metals were added. The Japanese added, and this has a good deal of lead in it. We know that the Chinese added lead. It also has a very, very high tin content, which oxidizes much darker than if it has a high copper content. So that's why we get this very, very rich colors. This figure, we did not look at this particular bodhisattva when we were looking at Chinese art, although I did kind of use it once as an example, I think, when we were looking at Southeast Asia. But it's a very good example of the influence of Tang sculpture in Japan. And in fact, that stance, that body bend, goes all the way back to India. I mean, this is what's, that Trabanga or three body bend pose from India, translated this way in the Tang Chinese style, and now that's being transported to Japan in these figures. So it's an elegant style. It's beautifully decorative style. So do I have the, yeah, here's our detail of Yakushi. Now this is much more of a Chinese style. It's quite different from what we saw before. You can see that rich patina there, but you can also see the very rounded face. The figures are very fleshy overall. It's totally different style from the earlier Shaka piece that was Korean influence. So neither of these are yet a developed Japanese style. One is Korean influence and one is a Chinese influence, but beautiful pieces. You still see nonetheless in both of them that wonderful abstract sense of form, both in the drapery as it falls and in the decorative swirling forms of the mandorla behind, behind the figure itself. During the Nara period, one emperor rose to great power. His name was Shomu. It doesn't that matter what his name was that much. But under Emperor Shomu, Buddhism became a state religion. And he really used it to consolidate his power. Although, of course, like most of the rulers we're going to see, he basically ignored the tenets of Buddhism. But nonetheless, he tried to align himself very, very closely with the Buddhist monks and power structure in Nara. And he did this, and he wanted to unite church and state, do more than make it a state religion. Just because it's a state religion doesn't mean you've united church and state. That's not quite the same thing. He wanted to unite the church and state under himself, of course, and that's largely because he recognized the growing power of these monasteries and these powerful authorities, monastic authorities in Nara. Nara is the holy city. This is where all of the monasteries are. This is where all of the power lies within the Buddhist world. And if you control the monasteries and the monks, then you control the people, the common people, to a great extent. He became a zealot, and he decided he wanted to build the greatest monastery, the biggest one in Japan. And so to do it, he destroyed a good part of the city of Nara, where people actually lived, and tore down homes and houses, and built this massive monastery complex known as Todaiji. And Todaiji, we'll look at it in more detail. I want to look first at the building, and then we'll talk about Todaiji. Todaiji literally means the Great Eastern Temple Complex. Dai means great, and To is Eastern, so it means the Great Eastern Temple Complex, because that's where it was in the city. And he liked that Dai being on there. And one of the things built in Todaiji is the Daibutsu-den. The Daibutsu-den is called that because it held the Daibutsu. Butsu is Buddha in Japanese. So the Daibutsu would be the great Buddha, and Den on the end refers to a building that holds a Buddha sculpture. So the name Daibutsu Den means the building that holds the great sculpture of Buddha. It's literally what it means. And what you're seeing here is not the original building. This building, wooden building, this is still the largest wooden building in the world, even though it's only 2/3 the size of the original Daibutsu Den. Because it was wooden, it was damaged, it had fires, it was constantly being sort of rebuilt, and each time it would get a little smaller and a little smaller. And that's true of the figure inside, which we will also take a look at. You know, to build this massive site, he not only had to tear down a good part of the city, he used conscripted labor, and he tried very hard to control the monks, but it actually just didn't work. They had more power than he realized he had. So the Great Buddha Hall is a new kind of building. It sort of replaces the Hondo. It's something even more than that. And actually, the original sculpture inside was almost 160 feet tall, almost 16 stories tall, the original sculpture. So the original building was actually built around that sculpture. First, the sculpture was made, and then they built the building around it. That's really kind of how you had to do it. The building inside, however, now is only about 50 foot. So the original was considerably larger. This is the sculpture that's in it now. It's literally tiny compared to the first. this one is just sort of in its shadow. It depicts Roshana Buddha, who is Vairocana, one of the five transcendents, really the most important. As I said before, he's known as a lot of other names. The original took 4 years to cast, and when it was cast, it took all of the country's bronze, to the point where there was no more bronze casting for close to a century after that figure was made. There was no more bronze ore in Japan to make that piece. It was also heavily damaged over time, and it has been reconstructed many, many times. And every time it gets a little smaller and a little less like the original. The current piece is very, very squared off and very squat, and probably looks pretty much nothing like the original. However, we do have a sculpture from the time of the original, a smaller piece, which is located at a neighboring monastery. This is not a gigantic piece, but it is from the date of the original, and it also depicts Roshana Buddha. So we widely assume the original probably looked more like this. So it was a much rounder figure, less squat and squared off. And to me, they don't look very much alike at all. It's really quite different. So it's from Toshodaiji, and it has that more Chinese sort of rounded features. Shomo, when he built this monastery, and particularly this building and this sculpture, he wanted it to be a symbol of the state, and particularly a symbol of the union of church and state under him as a ruler. But as I said, that never really happened. One of my favorite aspects of this, there you can see the inside of the the Daibutsudan, and you can see the Roshana figure there. But one of the most famous parts of this is this pole. There is this pole in the Daibutsudan, and there's a hole drilled through it that it's called Buddha's nostril, and it's supposedly the exact size of the nostril of the Buddha in the original figure. And the thing is, you want to climb through the Buddha's nostril. You want to climb through the hole in the post. Is it supposedly good luck or whatever? It doesn't look that big. It looks pretty small, and it looks to me like you have to be pretty thin to climb through the Buddha's nostril. Not to mention, it looks very claustrophobic. I find this picture difficult to even look at with someone crawling through there, but that's the tradition. You crawl through the nostril of the Buddha. In the Nara period, we begin to see a greater interest in realism, something that we really didn't see in Chinese art until very, very late. But there's always an interest in this in Japanese art. And this is really a beautiful priest, the priest Ganjin. Ganjin is actually a Japanese pronunciation of his real name, his Chinese name, Jiangzhen. He was a Chinese monk who was sent for in order to teach and ordain Japanese monks. There was at this period no one in Japan who was qualified to teach or perform ordinations. And so when this Chinese monk set out for Japan, it took him, and I don't know why, but it took him 7 years. Apparently he was just walking, 7 years to get there. And by the time he got there, he was blind when he arrived. And this is an attempt to depict, certainly he's in meditation, but also a suggestion that he cannot see. And when he got there, he held a massive ordination ceremony in 755 at Todaiji for 400 monks and nuns. And this was a huge event. Monks came from all over the country. A lot of Chinese monks came down. It was a very big event. He also is known for introducing a strict Vinaya. The Vinaya in Buddhism are a set of rules that monks and nuns live by, the Vinaya. it's sort of like the rules of Saint Benedict, you know, in the Christian church. It's just a bunch of rules of how you live. And he brought the strict Vinaya, and they really hadn't been taught that before. So he really concentrated on teaching that, and on the precepts on discipline and rules of behavior. Now, this is actually made in it's painted, but it's in a technique that is a little different, known as dry lacquer. And dry lacquer, we know lacquer, we saw in Chinese art, is just when you take the sap from a lacquer tree or bush, tree mostly, and put it over something wooden, and it's like a varnish, it seals it, and then you can carve into it, whatever. But this is a different process. This is a process in which you use lacquer soaked hemp cloth. You take cloth and soak it in lacquer and then lay it over a clay core. So you would model this figure in clay and then lay strips of this lacquer soaked cloth over it. So it's going to dry to a hard surface, and then you can remove the clay and you just have this hollow, lightweight, freestanding figure. So there's no wood under there, no clay under there. It's completely hollow, and then you can paint over it. It's a really great technique. You can also use taking dry wood powder, like sawdust or sort of a powdered wood form, mix it with lacquer, and then you can model with it. You can add details to it, or use it almost like a modeling clay on the surface of the lacquer, and then paint the lacquer over the top. So that's a very popular technique, also for getting really strong sense of realism, but also that very Japanese sort of expressiveness and emotion. You know, Japanese art also has an emotional content that you didn't always see in Chinese work. Also during this period, we see the early images of Myo-o, and Myo-o is simply the Japanese name for these wrathful deities, Dharma protectors or Dharma kings, these wrathful deity figures. They're going to get really, really popular a little bit later in Japan, but they are beginning at this time. And it is reminiscent of that Chinese figure we looked at, the Tong figure, remember the guardian figure at the Lungmen caves in China. It's very similar in design, but there's a much greater sense of realism in the Japanese figure. So we'll be coming back to these because these are going to become extremely popular. Okay, the ruling family under the control of the Fujiwara clan will move their seat of rule from Nara to Heian-kyo. Heian-kyo, or Heian-kyo as it was called, the city of Heian, is modern day Kyoto, where the ancient name is Heian-kyo, so they ended up dropping the Heian and it just becomes Kyoto, or it's the same city. The name means capital of peace and tranquility. They moved it about 20 miles north of Nara to this new site because where the former emperor Shomu had tried to control the power and limit the power of these authorities, these powerful monks and other authorities in Nara, the Han ruling families just decided, well, let's just get away from them. We can't control them, so let's just get out of Nara. So they basically left to get away from those powerful monks. Shomu tried to link Buddhism to the state power, and supported these various schools of monks. They just took a step away from it. Nara was just too steeped in tradition. It made changing the power structure was just too hard. Better just walk away from them and let them do their thing and worry about the rest of Japan and stop worrying about it. This period, the Heian, is one of my favorite periods because it actually marks the most Japanese period in all of Japan. If the previous period was the most Chinese, this is the most Japanese, and it's a real rejection and turning their back on Chinese style. And there are reasons for that. It has to do with things that are happening in China at the time. So it's a backlash against Chinese influence that had pervaded Nara. So this anti-Chinese sensibility was beginning as early as 800 in the late Tang. Remember, in the late Tang dynasty, while the Tang was in general in China a very open period, it was a great golden age. At the very end, it became very sort of paranoid, and there was a lot of persecution of Buddhism in the late Tang. And that's what's happening now. Japanese monks in China are coming home, they're being persecuted, and it caused or led to this rejection of Chinese influence. The connections were broken, and many Japanese monks returned home. The powerful Fujiwara clan controlled the emperors still through marriages at this time, and cultivated a very courtly and sophisticated sensitivity. They saw Chinese culture as sort of crude, not sensitive. The Japanese see their culture as more sensitive. The only period they are going to appreciate from here on in China is the Song dynasty, and the date, this period overlaps with the Song dynasty. So as the Song dynasty rises to power, and that, remember, was very sophisticated art in China, it's most sophisticated. The Japanese will identify with that, but not at the beginning. Buddhism turned to changed a bit. It formed closer relationships with indigenous religion, especially Shinto, particularly the Shingon sect of esoteric Buddhism became very close to Shinto. New temple sites were often built near Shinto shrines, often in the woods, in the country, which was not typical of Buddhist monasteries, but they're sort of following that Shinto tradition now. They rejected Chinese building styles of sort of massive structures and outward displays of power and prosperity to a Japanese sensibility. This is when they also create their own written phonetic alphabet and reject the Chinese characters. That's part of this sort of national sensibility or nationalism at the time. Their script was much more flowing and more cursive than the architectonic script, although we know Chinese script can be very fluid and cursive as well. As the power shifted from Buddhist schools, it shifted more and more to the clans, the powerful clans. Esoteric Buddhism dominates this period with their emphasis on mandala practices, which in Japan is known as mandara, written with an R. Japanese language does not have an R. Sound is extremely difficult for a Japanese speaker to pronounce anything with an R in it. So they pronounce mandala. Pardon me, it's an L. They can't pronounce the L. So they pronounce it mandara. And so then they begin writing it with an R. And I think I mentioned before, my teacher for Japanese art was Japanese, and he insisted that it is spelled with an R. It's mandara, A-R-A. So we learned to spell it with an R. Tibetans do that too. They can't pronounce a lot of Sanskrit, so they change a lot of the spellings to match their pronunciation. So we know that esoteric Buddhism, like Tibetan Buddhism, was steeped in mandala practice or mandara practice. I'm using the spelling that is really generally used. And I want to look really briefly at two very popular mandalas. The relationship to Tibetan art is very, very strong. Not only are the colors, these are the Tibetan colors, the reds, the greens, the yellows is what you see in Tibetan art, the nature of the imagery and the form. But I want to look at two. They're called the womb world mandala and the diamond world mandala, and they're always found together because they relate to one another. This is the first one, the womb world mandala, and it's made of concentric squares. It's very mandala. We have Buddha, one Buddha in the center, a Butsu, and then circled by additional Buddha figures. We're not going to look at all the detail or go into the symbolism, but it's that concentric hierarchy that maps out or frames what is believed to be, the hierarchy of the cosmos itself. The womb world, it's said that our world exists in the womb of the Buddha. That's where the reference to womb world comes from. But it symbolizes the phenomenal world. In other words, the relative world, the physical world that we live in. That's the womb world. And here's a detail of it where you can see some of the seated figures. And I honestly don't know the symbolism. I know all around the outside we have wrathfuls and other symbols. You would have to take some time. Here's the terminology. Butsu is Buddha. Bosatsu is Bodhisattva. So there are Butsus and Bosatsus, and this is of the Shingon sect. The other, and we'll put them side by side in a minute, but the other mandala that goes with it is the diamond world. Now, this is also a very Tibetan concept because Vajrayana, which is the type of esoteric Buddhism practiced in Tibet, Vajra means diamond. So the Vajrayana is the diamond vehicle. So in this case, the diamond world mandala represents the noumenal world, or in other words, the spiritual, the absolute. And it has 9 squares. I love this, how this one is organized. It's a bit more complex organization. It's 9 squares overall, but each square has its own organization principle. So there are 9 squares within each of the 9 squares. And then within each of these squares, there are 9 squares. So it becomes this sort of infinite folding in on itself. That's the noumenal world. That's the absolute, where it's sort of an infinite turning on oneself. Now this interestingly has the upper panels are different from the lower panels. And we get figures in other forms here. Beautiful presentation. This is a detail of one of these where you have 9 squares inside each of the 9, and then 9 figures within each of those 9 figures, and then others filling in the forms. This is very like a Tibetan sand mandala, could look very much like this. So the two together, one grounded in the physical world, the womb world, one grounded in the diamond world, or the phenomenal noumenal world, I should say. Together, they symbolize this interconnectedness of the relative and the absolute world. They make reality together. They are the essential expression of esoteric Buddhism in many ways. Worlds within worlds within worlds, all coming together to create one reality that balances the two. Does anybody have a question?
On the 3, the Asukra,
Yeah.
One of them was really shiny, like it was maybe gilded. They were bronze, and one was really dark, and one,
Right.
Did they gild them? Is that why?
They sometimes did, yes. So it is possible that earlier Chaka Triad might have had gilt on it. They're probably not the Yakushi. That's a beautiful patina. They wanted that beautiful bronze.
Yeah,
but we're going to look at one in just a minute that's gilded.
Yeah, no, I'm talking about the first one you showed.
Right, that one. I think it's. I'm not sure. If it was, the gold would probably be gone. That's probably just a polish shine from the bronze itself.
Well, brass polishes up like that, but
yeah.
Okay.
High tin.
It was weird.
Okay. So let's move on. I'll show you a really, really beautiful building. It's also, we're still in the Heian period, the period that's the most Japanese. This is a group of buildings known as the Phoenix Hall or the Byodo Inn, located in Uji. And it's associated with Pure Land Buddhism, which is known as Jodo in Japan. Jodo is Pure Land. With Amida, remember, in his Western paradise, became very popular in the late Heian, even more than it was before. It spread throughout Japan by various monks. We're going to encounter some images of monks that helped spread Pure Land Buddhism. It's meant to be just like the paintings. We saw paintings of Amida, we saw paintings of the Pure Land that were meant to be these beautiful paradise. This building is equivalent to that. It's meant to be equivalent to paradise, the most beautiful place. Originally, this site, there was a building that was a retreat for the Fujiwara family, and they were the ruling clan at that time. It was a private estate, but then in 1052, it was turned into a temple, and then this building was completed in 1053. The beauty of the building itself, just like the paintings of Amida, are meant to be aids to your meditation, and particularly to your mantra. It's known as an Nembutsu practice. We'll talk more about that in just a minute, but you keep calling on the name of Amida. Remember, in Japanese, it's Namu Amida Butsu, Namu Amida Butsu, which is like hail to Amida Buddha, or honor to Amida Buddha. And buildings, images, paintings, anything, these were aids to that. So they're visualizations. You're visualizing the Western paradise. So this is what it would look like. It's called that for several reasons. If you look up on top, you can see the phoenixes way up here at the top, the finials, but these are phoenixes at the very, very top, and they symbolize, good government. And remember, this is the ruling family in power at the moment. They're located on an island, a sort of semi-detached island. This is the main building and two side buildings in very Japanese style architecture. But it's also reminiscent of a bird. You can see sort of the wings that are spread in the design of the building as a whole. Upswept, the roof lines upswept a little bit like the wings of a bird. It's more elegant than you would see in a pagoda or a kondo. It's the same architectural style, but it is more ornate than we would see in a simple monastery. And that's because it's Pure Land, because it's a Jodo site, and they're going to emphasize the beauty of it more than anything else. So there's still an element of Chinese design, particularly in the exposure of the bracketing here as well. Inside this building, the water is important too, because it reflects, the reflection of the beautiful building just sort of doubles the beauty of the site. That's certainly part of it. And inside the building is a very, very famous sculpture of Amida, sculpted by someone named Jocho, and he was well known at the time. Now this is gilded wood. I'll show you how it's made in just a moment, but this is gold over the whole thing. It's made out of 53 different blocks of wood. It's what we call a Raigo figure. A Raigo is a term associated with Pure Land Buddhism, and it means welcoming. So a Raigo figure is meant to be Amida welcoming you. And the mudra he's using is called the Raigo In mudra. It's unique to Amida. You'll never see anybody but Amida doing this. You do see it in, I see people like in movies and television shows, whatever, they do some meditation mudra and they tend to do this one. For some reason, this is stuck in people's mind and this is all they know for a meditation mudra, but it's not the typical meditation mudra at all. It's unique to Amida. Now, supposedly a Raigo figure is one which appears very, very approachable. But I honestly don't see this figure as very approachable. He's rather imperious and off-putting to me. I'm not sure what it is about this anyone would see as a particularly welcoming features in this figure. Particularly the point of view itself is sort of difficult. But it is meant to be an image of perfection, and it certainly is that. It's made of individual blocks, as was this figure. This is him from the side. As you can see, many different blocks. There is a name for this. I can't remember. We just call it joined block carving. I can't remember the Japanese name, but this is how blocks would be attached together, and then you would carve the wood. So it's not like one big piece of wood. It's a bunch of pieces of wood that are attached in roughly the shape that you want, and then you carve them. It's a particularly elegant detailing on the mandorla behind the figure, very, very abstracted, very stylized. So this is golden lacquer over the wood itself, but it's really the painting during this period that sets it apart and marks it as an important period in Japan. Remember, this is a period where they're rejecting the Chinese style and creating, in many ways, a Japanese style. They literally created a Japanese style of painting. This is when it is born, and that's the Yamato-e. Yamato-e is literally means a Japanese picture. The A signifies picture, so Yamato is Japanese, versus the Kara-e, which is the Chinese picture. And we'll talk about that in a little bit too, what that meant to them. So it's always interesting to see how people define terms. You know, what do they mean when they say this is a Japanese picture versus what do they mean when they say it's Chinese? What is it in a Chinese painting that they see as being Chinese? Some other terms, emakimono, you sometimes see this with hyphen in between the letters, making it easier to read. Makimono, maki, sometimes it'll just be called a maki, which is a scroll. We know that A means picture because we just learned that up above with Yamato. The mono on the end is a difficult word to define. It means, well, the only best way to translate it is a thing. You know, it's a scroll with pictures in a particular format. So it's a picture scroll thing. I mean, that's kind of the best way to translate it. So in makimono, we're also going to see later kakemono, which is a hanging scroll, but we'll get to that later. This is an amaki or an makimono. And there are certain aesthetics that will be important in a Yamato-e style. One of them is a ware. Subject scenes are going to be deeply moving. This is part of that sort of emotion that underlies a pure Japanese sensibility. And I don't mean outward display, but a very reserved and quiet, subtle way of communicating emotion. Miyabi, courtly elegance. The earliest piece that we're going to be looking at is a reflection of the court, but in a very different way from the Chinese. And then in some cases, okashi, not always, not every scene is going to have that in it, but that underlies a lot of the ongoing scenes is a sort of quiet humor. They will also develop their own feminine style, masculine style. We saw that also in Chinese art. And I'll remind you of that. Ona-e, which is a feminine style. And by feminine, they're going to see the use of opaque colors. But particularly in the subject matter, what's very intriguing is that a feminine subject is one that is more introverted and is more about feelings than actions, which I find really interesting because that's some sort of universal interpretation of feminine has to do with these ideas, where the otoko-e, the masculine style, is going to be more active. It's about action. It's not about people thinking about how they would feel if this event happened. It's about doing it, and that's the masculine. Also, the emphasis more on line, which is rooted in calligraphy, is seen as masculine, where the emphasis on color, and particularly opaque color, is seen as more feminine. So we'll see that in some of the works. The single most famous Japanese scroll in the world is the very famous version of the Tale of Genji, which was made during the Heian period. It is a Yamato-e, but it's also Ona-e, the female or feminine style. Now, before we talk about the style, let's talk about what the subject of this hand scroll is. It's based on a story, a novel really, written by Lady Murasaki Shikibu, or Lady Murasaki is usually how she's known. She was a lady in waiting to the Empress in the late 10th century, and she wrote this long, sprawling novel. In English translation, it's about 1,000 pages, so it's very, very long. Many women actually during this period were really involved in a great flowering of Japanese literature and also painting. So there is a real sort of golden age for women's literature. As a novel, it has 53 chapters. Originally, when it was visualized and presented in a scroll, there were between 10 and 12 separate scrolls of about 5 chapters each. So there were over 400 characters, and it tells the story of these people in the court life over 3 different generations. So it is a long, sprawling, epic story. Today, we only have about 20 scenes that are extant, and they come from 13 different chapters in the scroll. It's not what you would expect to be perhaps stories of formal court life or the like. It's actually a very private world of living in court. The whole thing is like a giant soap opera. It's a long, sprawling narrative of these court behaviors, not formal, but sort of the informal life. It's told in text and language in veiled images. They don't show and cannot show outward emotion, but it's a deeply emotional story, and the scenes are emotional. The emotions communicated largely through colors and shapes. Different colors have different emotions, also through gestures, subtleties in terms of the positioning of the head or the hand, things that would be readable at the time that would be hard for us to understand, perhaps in things like maybe a figure hurrying away or the fluttering of drape. In this particular scene, for example, this screen has been pulled open, suggesting someone had been watching. This figure is behind a screen. We'll talk more about Japanese traditional interiors, and we'll look at some Japanese screens and things later. But traditionally, Japanese homes or buildings had very little architecture and very few walls. Space was created through moving sliding screens and portable folding screens. So the idea of someone, you were living right on top of each other. There was little real privacy. And so someone could be hiding behind a screen, eavesdropping on this conversation, things like that. That's the sort of thing that's happening. So the stories in the Tale of Genji, and we'll talk about who Genji is in just a minute, but have to do with, who's really in love with who's having an affair with who, soap opera stuff. I mean, that's really what it is. And it has very little to do with action and everything to do with feeling, whose heart is breaking, who's just learned some horrible thing that they can't talk about. Now, stylistically, this is absolutely Yamato-e style. First of all, it's very flat overall. You have no horizon line. Typically, Yamato A, the ground is tipped up. So you really never see a horizon line. It's as if the roof of a building has been lifted off and you have a kind of bird's eye view looking down into the building. So it's a very unique point of view, not Chinese in any way. It's also dominated by diagonals. What gives it a sort of living dynamism is not necessarily the movement of the people, but the placement of the forms on these strong diagonals that pull you along and pull you through the storyline as it unfolds. Now, this is Ona-e style, or the feminine style. You clearly see the use of flat, opaque color. This is not so much about calligraphic line. You don't see, there's some lines visible over here, but by and large, it's color and flat color. This particular one, which is known as the Azumaya chapter, this particular scene, we have a maid who's reading to a noble woman who's having her hair brushed, someone else over here, someone else eavesdropping on the story, stylized emotions to a great extent. It's a language, as I said, of veiled images and costumes and hurrying figures, often dealing with just sort of these private, intimate moments. This is a very private, intimate moment, not at all a courtly moment. Because it is a hand scroll, just like we've seen in China, it moves from right to left. So we start on the far right and you read it to the left. The format itself of a hand scroll is by nature private and intimate. We've talked about this before as well. You hold it in your hands, you alone are looking at it. So I think that the Japanese way of using a hand scroll is taking hand scrolls to their fullest development, more so than the way they were used in China formally. They're an intimate medium in this style. You know, comparing it to the admonition scroll, you know, it's hard not to make a comparison. Admonition scroll in China was about court life, but it was about formal court life. It's a totally different spatial conception. There is no ground line, there is no horizon line, there is no real space. The figures are just sort of floating there in the air and you're seeing them directly from the side. So that is entirely different. And there's nothing private or intimate about it. It's very, very formal, speaking of behavior and how to behave, not about how people actually behave behind the scene. So one is sort of, you know, the Chinese scroll is a sort of artificial face of how you're supposed to behave in a setting, where the Japanese is sort of pulling the curtains back and looking at what really happens behind the scenes in court life, and therefore is really very, very different. The Suzumushi chapter, this is one of my favorites. This depicts stylized emotion in a really extreme way. You know, in the book, this is Genji seated right here. He is a sort of minor figure in the court. He had believed himself to be the half brother of a ruling emperor, but he still believes himself to be the half brother of the ruling emperor. And he's just gone with a few of his friends to meet with the emperor at a moon viewing party. A moon viewing party would be exactly what it sounds like. It's a gathering when there's a particularly beautiful moon, full moon or whatever, and you go out on the veranda, because all traditional Japanese buildings have these beautiful verandas for viewing gardens, or in this case, for viewing the moon. And in the story, as he's walking to this party, he hears the sounds of a flute off in the distance. So the artist has put a flute player in here so that, it evokes that moment, and we remember what that moment in the story was. We also know from the story, often the case in soap operas, where different characters have different levels of knowledge. One person knows something the other person doesn't know. That's common. Well, this is the emperor, and he has just found out that Genji is not his half brother, but Genji is actually his son. And so what we've got is this very, very poignant emotional moment where this emperor, who's just getting ready to retire as emperor, and Japanese emperors often retired. They didn't necessarily rule till they died. He's sitting here in front of his son, but propriety dictates he can't do anything about it. He wants to rush up and hug his son and say, I am your father. And he can't do it. It's that stoic, keep it inside, don't show emotion. That was the sort of rule. And much of the tale of Genji kind of focuses on that ritualized behavior, that required behavior among people that makes it inappropriate to express your emotions. So a scene like this is a very, very poignant one and an emotional one, even though you kind of have to know the story to understand that. If you don't know the story, you would not know this, but everyone seeing this, everybody knows the story of Genji. It's a very, very well-known novel in Japan. So he can't express it openly. So this has all those characteristics of Yamato A, flat diagonal lines, no horizon line, opaque color. And also it's about feeling, not acting. It's not about action. Diagonals dominate still. All of those things are there. But I want to look at an image from another scroll that is also Yamato A. However, it is Otoko A. It is a masculine style now. And this is a really fun image from the Shingasan and Engi. An Engi is a type of story that purports to explain the supernatural founding of a monastery. Every monastery would want to have an engi written about them that linked the founding of the monastery with some supernatural event. It would lend authority to that monastery in some way. And the Shigesan engi is about a monastery that was founded on Mount Shigi. That's why it's called the Shigesan engi, in which a boy traveled to Nara and he built a hermitage on the top of Mount Shigi. And then there are many, many stories of miracles that happen, and other monks come, and then they found this monastery. And one of these miraculous stories is that there was a man in the town. One of the things that people were expected to do was to give to the monastery. That was part of how you practice Buddhism, is you gave things to the monastery. And there was a greedy man in the town, and he wouldn't donate any grain to the monastery. And so the monks sent this bowl, the monk's bowl that they would normally go down to get grain. They sent the bowl down, it flew down, and the bowl slipped underneath his granary and picked up the building and flew the whole thing up to the top of the mountain. So it's a wonderful little story about a greedy man who, loses his whole granary, but it's all action. It's all about these guys running around and gesturing, and everyone is, oh, did you see this? And it's completely different from the tale of Genji. This isn't about, oh, how do I feel about that granary floating away? This is about me running around, pulling out my hair and screaming because the granary is flying away. And the style itself is different. It is Yamato-e, but it's not as colorful. It doesn't have large areas of opaque color. It's about line, and it's a very active kind of line, linear forms that are reminiscent of a calligraphy, and that's part of it. More than anything, though, I think it's the action-driven style, as the simple people in the village are watching these miraculous results. This is very typical. Things like this function to legitimate the monastery. This has its roots in something supernatural in a way. So we've seen the Nara period, the most Chinese. We've seen a reaction against that in the Heian and the development of true Japanese art and architecture for the first time. We've seen Buddhism reshaped a bit in the emphasis, under the influence of the esoterics and Pure Land, and most particularly the development of Yamato-e. Now, the Heian period, this was an art of the cultured upper classes in Heian-kyo, in the city of Heian, or Heian-kyo. This was the art of them. When the Fujiwara clan begins to lose power to other clans, a civil war takes place, and it lasts for about 5 years, and it ends up with two clans finally fighting it out, the Taira and the Minamoto, and the Minamoto clan is victorious, and Minamoto no Yoritomo, who is the head of that clan, takes power. Now, the Minamoto are very different people than the Fujiwara. The Fujiwara had been connected to the imperial family for generations. They were a very cultured clan and people in their own right. The Minamoto are not. They are people who are a real warrior clan. They're not from Heian, and they don't really have much use for this highly cultured life in Heian. And so one of the things they do to separate themselves is to rule from their home, which is at Kamakura, which is quite a way away from the court. They're trying to separate them. Now, this is very different. Traditionally, before this, ruling clan families wanted to connect themselves to the imperial family, usually marrying into it and seeing that as a source of their power. But by this time, and this is really the beginning of what we call medieval Japan, this is the beginning of feudal medieval Japan, clans like the Minamoto are powerful enough that they don't really need to connect themselves to the emperor. In fact, they want to distance themselves. They're still going to claim that the emperor has, in a sense, anointed them, but they're not going to go to Heian and live as if they were aristocrats. They're going to rule from Kamakura, and in fact, a new title is created for Minamoto, for Yoritomo, and that is shogun. He is the first to rule as shogun. His full title is Saitai Shogun, which means barbarian quelling general, but shogun just means a general. And he has the emperor give him this title. And that alone is all he really needed to rule in the name of the emperor. The emperor gives me this title. It's sort of like, the Pope crowning someone is making a powerful statement in Europe in the Middle Ages. This is now the emperor giving him this new title. And it's really the beginning of Japan that most Westerners are familiar with. When we think of Japan, it's mostly from this period onward. The shogun title would continue until 1868, when the last shogun is removed from power, and that will be really because of the Americans, and we'll talk about that later. The Kamakura period is a period that is dominated by military clans. It's a period of the rise of the rise of the daimyo, well, actually, let's leave that on because I've got some names here. The rise of the daimyo, the feudal lords, these powerful feudal lords. It's a feudal system very much like Western Europe. These feudal lords are absolute rulers within their territory. And then you've got really the most powerful of the daimyo who gets the title of shogun. This is the period when samurai become important. Samurai first begin to be used a little after 1000, but the height of the samurai begins in the Kamakura period. We'll see more about them. Daimyo is actually a term that these feudal lords created for themselves. Daimyo actually translates as great person. I am a great person. I mean, who names themselves that? It comes to mean, more than that. Of course, it comes to mean, the military. And so that is going to be, that kind of subject matter is going to be popular, these individuals. And this is one of my favorite pieces from the Kamakura. And in many ways, this is just an excerpt from a much longer scroll. To me, this is one of the most perfect uses of a hand scroll that I've ever seen, because there's something about a hand scroll that is very active and very cinematic. It unrolls in your hands the way a film unrolls in front of you. It's about action. And when you have a subject that's just these still vignettes one after the other, you're not really using the hand scroll to its fullest potential, its potential to show movement and action and drama. But now it's going to be used that way. Now, this is a complete rejection in some ways of the aesthetics of the Heian, because it's now removed from the court. We still have, however, a Yamato style. It's still Yamato-e. It's just not the quiet sophistication of the court. It's still tipped up. It's still, this is a masculine style, absolutely. But it's more than anything, it's a new set of values. The values of the warriors, the values of the feuding clan, the values of violence and death to a great extent. So the burning of the Sanjo Palace in Kyoto by the Minamoto forces. Now this is depicting an actual event that took place in around 1182 or 3. It's about the founding of the Kamakura period when the Minamoto will win, but it wasn't painted until later. So it was painted in the late 13th century, but about an earlier event in which a former emperor is kidnapped. The specific story doesn't really matter. What matters is a whole bunch of people killing each other. That's really what it's about. It comes from what is known as the Heiji Monogatari Emaki. Monogatari is extended epic, a great extended epic story. Emaki just means it's a hand scroll, like scroll Genji. Here are some details. There's just scene after scene. It actually begins in the far right, of course. It begins with just two people walking, and they're, of course, walking to our left because that's the direction the scene is going to move. And then as you turn the scroll, a few more people appear, and then it's a crowd, and then a few more people appear, and then the people are running, and then the people are on horses, and it builds and builds and builds in a beautifully cinematic way. The whole scroll is all image, as you might expect if you think about it. It's no stopping and telling you a story. There's no poetry, there's no word. It's just action from beginning to end. This is action. It is a dynamic, completely, there's a little bit of text at the end that kind of tells the story, but they're not going to stop any of the scenes with that kind of subtlety. There's a lot of detail of weapons and images. It's a wonderful scroll for really studying the clothing, the battle strategies, the samurai armor and the details. The samurai, you can see the principal role of the samurai early on are as equestrian archers. That is their great skill, is that they can shoot, they can ride with two hands free and shoot accurately with the bow and arrow while riding full out. That's the major skill. Yes, they have swords, and swordmanship will become actually more important later, but they have their swords because, you know, you might fall off your horse or something, so then you fight in a different way. You can see some of the armor here. Hundreds and hundreds of, they might employ hundreds of different samurai. Samurai aren't just one thing. There are many levels of samurai. It has its own class system as well, and the armor and other things show that. This beautiful set of armor in the Nelson Gallery in a case by the giant, right next to where the giant Buddha figure is. It has samurai armor there. Here's a good one where you can see sort of the guy cutting off someone's head. Collecting heads was very important. You know, I sent that email out about that series on Netflix. If you get a chance, if you're really interested in it, in Japan in the Middle Ages, it's called The Way of the Samurai. I think it's 5 or 6 parts. It's long. I was just going to watch a little bit of the first one. It's a docudrama. It's a documentary, but it also, you know, they act out, you know, they dramatize the scenes. And I couldn't stop. It was one of those things like it was, okay, 6 hours later, I've watched the whole thing. It's extremely complicated and really interesting and really gory in some way, but really lays out. It's from a little later period. It's not from the Kamakura, and it's about 3 succeeding shoguns that we're actually going to talk about, and we're going to see their palace and everything else. So highly recommended. You'll get hooked on it right away when it starts. It ends in a very similar way to how it begins. You know, you're unrolling, and then there's a little quieter, less action, and you unroll, and there's a single horseman, and you think, well, that's it, it's done. You roll a little bit more, and there's one last guy walking, and then you get some text at the end that sort of explains the story. So it's just brilliantly thought out as a storytelling device. As you can see, 16 inches by 23 foot. The Japanese always prefer the more exaggerated formats. The sort of album leaf and hanging scroll, and there will be hanging scrolls, but they prefer the more exaggerated horizontality of the hand scroll, and even hanging scrolls, they prefer a more exaggerated verticality. It's just more dramatic. Here's some samurai armor. I used to know more about this, but I don't remember it now. But it changes quite a bit over time. It's interesting to just read about, you know, how this developed and how it's made and what matters. This is 12th century, so this is the kind of armor that you see in the scroll. The colors, other details identify not only what army they're with, but their status within the hierarchy. This is 14th century armor. It gets a little bit better over time, a little bit stronger. And then this late 16th century armor is really powerful imagery. So I love samurai armor. So watch that docudrama if you get a chance. I want to look at some sculpture and see how this new warrior sensibility affects sculpture. There is, during this period, a flowering of Buddhism that's really kind of unprecedented in some ways. This warrior class is going to embrace different kinds of Buddhism. The people of Japan are going to embrace Pure Land. The warrior class themselves are going to embrace Zen, and I'll talk about that more later. But I want to look at a couple figures because esoteric is still around. This is a Choman of Todaiji. Todaiji is where the Daibutsu Den is located. This gateway was built later, again, fire, rebuild, common story in Japan with wooden architecture. But inside the gateway, since it's a gateway, you got to have guardian figures in a gateway, right? So what we get is a new style of sculpture that is associated with this particular period. Two brothers, Unkai and Kikai, were both sculptors, and they are credited with the massive figures located in this chuman, figures on each side, known as the Kongo Rikishi. And that's another term for these Myo or sort of guardians or Dharma protector figures. They become very fierce. You know, prior to this period in Japan, these figures, these sort of Dharmapalas, they're sometimes called, or guardian figures, while they're sort of aggressive looking, they were never actually directly associated with warriors. But now they're going to be directly connected to a warrior culture and a warrior class. So they really, while they're still Dharma protectors, they take on a different connection in Japan, a different association. And the two figures that they created are two well-known figures that are known as Agyo and Unkyo. Okay, this is Agyo and this is Ungyo across from him, and they're very, very large. The names come from what they're saying. One is saying ah, and one is saying So his mouth is open, so that's Agyo, and his mouth is closed. He's saying and together they are saying aum. It's a breakdown or symbolism of the mantra of aum. The two syllables ah and put together symbolize completeness. Aum is like a whole. So the mouth expressions identify the mantra syllable that they are saying, and the two together symbolize completeness. But it's really their fierceness and their really frightening scale as they look down on you. And this is how you would see them at this angle. That really links them to this moment in time. Here's a close-up of Ungo again. And my two favorites of these guys were made at this period for Horyuji, the much, much earlier temple, the first one that we looked at. These were added to their chuman in 1203 by Jokai. And these are stunning figures. I love these two guys. It's also Agyo and Ungyo, so one with an open mouth, one with a closed. These guys are really fierce, and they're looking at you. I mean, you know, these aren't just sort of generally guarding the entrance. They're really looking at you like you're a threat. But these are beautiful and uniquely Japanese. So you're not going to see anything like this in China at all. Also related to this sort of dominance of the warrior clan is an increasing emphasis on real portraiture. It's a very political period when power was everything. Your position and power in relation to the shogun is everything. And it's not surprising that realistic portraiture is associated with that. It's the same thing that happened in ancient Rome, which was a place where power mattered, who you are mattered, who you were connected to mattered. And so you needed to recognize people and see people. Realism is always political in art, whether it's in the East or the West. And so there's a flowering, not that this particular piece is political, but there's a flowering of realism broadly. And I love this priest, Shunjobo. He is one of many priests who this is actually located in Todaiji. He was a Shingon monk, meaning he was an esoteric practitioner, but he sort of became a Pure Land practitioner. There were a lot of monks like that. He walked around Japan and talked about Pure Land, and he's doing his Nembutsu practice, which is just repetition of Namo Amida Butsu, and he's counting I don't know why he's bothering to count. There's no particular reason to count when you just say it continuously. It's not like he's going to stop after he does it 108 times, which is normally what you would do. It's a beautiful piece. Shinto is known for, he made 3 different trips to China where he studied. He's shown here doing his Nembutsu practice. It's beautifully realistic. Now, this is just painted wood. So this would probably be joined wood painted, much like we saw before. You can see the face. Isn't that wonderful? I absolutely love the face. This has got to be a portrait. You don't invent somebody looking like this. You know, they look like that. It's absolutely beautiful. But my favorite sculpture from this period is known as the sage Kuyu, and Kuyu was another monk who also, he was a Tendai monk, who's another type of excuse me, another type of esoteric Buddhism, but he became a Pure Land practitioner as well, traveled around. But I love this piece. This walking stick has antlers, deer antlers on top, and I can't remember the story, but it's important. It has something to do with his conversion, or I don't remember the story. Anyway, but the most important part of it is what you see here. Coming out of his mouth is these are little figures. Each one of those is a little figure of Amida, Buddha. So each time, excuse me, each time he says his Nembutsu, each time he says Namo Amida Butsu, and Amida appears, because that's why you say it, right? You're saying it so that at the time of your death, Amida will swoop down and take you to the Western paradise. So what's intriguing about this piece, first of all, is a visualization of a mantra. You know, it's giving physical form to like these words that are coming out of his, literally physically coming out of his mouth. And also the way it juxtaposes the very realistic and the totally abstract concept. I mean, together, he's very real, but you see this, something about this sort of unique combination that just intrigues me. And I really love this particular piece. I think there's some more paintings coming up that are realism, and I think I'll just wait. We'll just start with this next time. But it's going to affect painting and portraiture and painting. And so this is Yoritomo, the founder of the dynasty, the one who really begins this new way. And it's an interesting new kind of portraiture that combines Yamato-e with what he needs in a portrait. It's full of symbolism and it's very different from Chinese. So we'll start with this next time. Does anybody have questions, comments, anything relating to what we've covered or talked about?
Peggy,
Yeah.
I'm just curious, technically, the one before this with the little figures coming out of his mouth, is that wire, or how did they technically do that?
That's a good question. I haven't seen this in person, so I don't know. My guess would be it would be something like that. Yeah, my guess would be that it's wire. I mean,
I don't think you could do that out of wood. I mean, it just,
you could probably do it out of like, what am I trying to think of? Like some sort of resinous material. You know, just like we saw
like a root
in
or
other
something.
figures.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you could use a lot of different things that were stiff, but honestly, I've never read what that is, so I'm not really sure.
It's sort of a miracle that it hasn't broken in all these centuries.
Yeah, maybe it has. I don't know.
Well, that's true.
It might have, and they put it back on.
It might have, yeah.
Yeah, they added it back on, so it could be something like that. I just don't know.
Huh.
Kay, you had a question?
Yeah, you talked about the masculine and the feminine style.
Yeah.
Does that have anything to do with the individuals who were practicing the styles? Did women paint?
Women did paint, and We don't really have a lot of information about who painted a lot of this, but it may very well have been court women who painted the scroll of Genji. We just don't know. So it is possible, but and that would certainly be part of the distinction.
Yeah.
But clearly the idea of the passiveness and the feeling over action is cultural stereotype, even if women weren't painting it. But I don't think there's, well, see, honestly, I don't want to say because I don't know. I don't know that there was like a social stigma that said women or men shouldn't paint that way. I don't know that would be the case. These are still pretty early things. So
I was just curious about which came first.
yeah, which came first.
Yeah.
Yeah. This isn't all stories of women at court. There are stories of men at court as well, but it is still about feelings.
Right.
Any other questions or comments?
You.
Nothing.
Very cool.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. We are moving right along in Japan. So we've probably got 2 more sessions, probably finish up Japan.
Thank you.
So if nothing else, then I will see you next week, which will probably be in a couple of hours, it will seem like. So
Thank you, Peggy.
we'll see you then. Have a good
Thank
week,
you.
everybody. You're
Bye.
welcome. Bye-bye.